Let's look at a typical web technology stack for a small business. Most businesses will need to keep track of their customers, not just in the short term, but over the long term, both before, during, and after sales. So they will need some kind of customer relationship management tool. And then to make sales, most businesses will need email marketing and sales funnels. And of course, their products and services need to be managed within an e-commerce module. And businesses may also need some kind of learning management system, whether that is as part of the services they provide, or perhaps just for internal training purposes. Related to this is the function of premium content and membership, which again may be external facing or internal facing. Some businesses may also wish to group their customers into groups and forums using some kind of community building tool. And finally, most businesses will need either appointments and or ticketing functions of some kind. And all of this needs to be tied together and managed using some form of automation. There are broadly two strategies to deliver these types of services to a business. We can use cloud services of various kinds, which I'll talk about in a minute, or we can try to employ the self-hosted website that a business may already have. And most small businesses these days would use the WordPress content management system for this. Of course, it's also possible to use a combination of cloud services and self-hosted tools. But the purpose of this presentation is to contrast the various benefits and drawbacks of cloud services versus self-hosted. And ultimately, this presentation seeks to persuade small business owners that it might be better to use the self-hosted option rather than the cloud services. And the reason for this is related to complexity, ease of management, and cost, as well as risk management. Let's now have a look at the self-hosted option, and then we'll have a look at the cloud service option to compare the two. In a self-hosted situation, the content management system, which is usually WordPress, takes care of the basic user management. So user data such as username and email address, and perhaps some other metadata, is stored in a table and managed by the content management system and the core function of that. With the addition of plugins or modules, additional user data is added to the core user data. For example, the e-commerce plugin will need to keep track of address details, such as physical and shipping address. The customer relationship module will need to keep track of when a user was last contacted and what correspondence was sent to them. Ticketing needs to keep track of both events and whether a user has attended or purchased tickets to those events. Forms will need to keep track of whatever data is in the form and attach that in the form of user data to the core user data. Similarly, for learning management systems, premium content, groups and forum. However, all of these work through the core user data and the core management functions of the content management system. In this type of architecture, the automation module can easily keep track of a user, usually by the use of a tag system of some kind, to keep track of events. So for example, if a user purchases a product, then a tag can be added in the user data, and then that can be picked up by automation, and then the automation can use that as a trigger for actions in another module. So for example, purchasing a product can add a person to a course, or add a person to be able to access premium content. Similarly, if somebody finishes a course, then they may be able to be offered a discount, for example, on a follow-on product. All the while, the customer relationship management module can handle email-based marketing funnels and add users and remove users from those funnels in response to various events that happen throughout the entire system. And finally, the sales funnel module can work in close concert with the e-commerce module as well to smooth the process of purchasing so as to reduce the incidences where users back out of a purchase. So then, while this architecture looks fairly complex, it is in fact about as simple as it can be given all of the comprehensive functionality that has been added. Let's now look at the cloud-hosted version of such a system. And in a moment we'll contrast the two, but what you can see almost immediately is a much more web-like, interrelated and interconnected system, and also a lot more duplication of data. Let's look at it in detail. The first thing to remember is that each of these cloud services are in fact separate web applications. So user data must be held by each of those services, and as a consequence there is significant duplication of data. The groups service needs username and email address, generally speaking, and so does the learning management system, and so does the e-commerce, the ticketing, the sales funnels, the CRM, and possibly forms as well. And of course the automation function needs to somehow keep track of all of these things. And a consequence of this is, for example, if a user changes something basic like their telephone number, that has to be promulgated through all of these systems. And there's also a question about where the truth, in other words, the central data, the most reliable data, actually resides. Depending on how the system was built, it might be in the CRM. That might be considered to be the main source of data. Or it might be in the learning management system, or it might be in the e-commerce system. But it's not clear from an architecture like this which data structure takes priority. Further complicating the picture, of course, is this line which I've indicated here, because this business may in fact have their own website as well. So in addition to all of that stuff going on up there, there is still core user data managed by whatever content management system is in play. Another aspect of this is considering the automation. So for example, if something happens in one of these modules, as we were discussing before, a person purchases a product, and the intention of that is to allow them access to the learning management system. Well, automation could be used to connect these two, and that could be using something like Zapier, for example. If that automation is used as the interface between these two, then the automation becomes aware of that interaction and then possibly could inform other functions or the parent website. However, a lot of these services have direct integrations available as well. So there are some design decisions that need to be taken about when these direct integrations might be used and how all of the integrations across all of these functions can be kept track of. Let's also consider the robustness of a system like this, its ability to cope with things going wrong, and how many things might possibly go wrong. All of the lines on this diagram travel across the internet from a web app to a web app, or from a web app via an automation, which is also another web app, to another web app. And these all travel across the web. So if there's some kind of communication problem, then the integration is going to be at risk. Contrast this with these lines, which are internal to one application. So yes, these are plugins, added to the WordPress content management system, but none of these lines require the internet connectivity between them to work. They are all within the one system. Now, some people may regard an all-in-one system to be analogous to the all the eggs in one basket metaphor. And it's true that this system will either work or it won't work. And there's a small possibility of internal problems as well. But ultimately, I think the risk of this suffering a major disaster is less than a system like this, because we can run backups of this entire system and possibly even keep an entire backup copy ready as a fallback system. That would be much more difficult to implement with a disparate system like this. So potentially, for example, here the learning management system could continue working if something happened to the e-commerce system, but with the possible complexity of these integrations and interrelationships there, it may run into some issue anyway. So, and not only that, the possibility of creating an entire backup of this entire system is so much more complicated than for a system such as this. So from my perspective, this system may be an all-in-one or all-or-nothing type of strategy, but even so, it's probably more resistant to disaster and also more easily recovered should something go wrong than a system such as this. Let's look at cost as well. Now, some of these services, such as Hubspot and ActiveCampaigns, ClickFunnels, not so much Eventbrite, but perhaps Shopify, Kajabi and Samcart and Thinkific, as well as some of the community services here, they are of the order of perhaps 100 or so a month for each of these, whereas these type of plugins would be of the order of hundreds per year. So without getting into the details, the software implementation costs of an architecture like this is likely to be about 10% of the software implementation costs of an architecture like this. Furthermore, the cost and fee structure for these services tends to increase with the number of users, but not necessarily with the number of users that might be contributing to profit. So for example, the CRM, you might have 3,000 people in the CRM, but not many of those might be actually generating sales in the e-commerce. So the cost is somewhat disconnected from the profitability. In contrast, there are generally no scaling effects here except for the hosting, which I'll come to in a moment. Basically, your content management system doesn't care whether you've got 10 users or 10,000 users. I mentioned hosting just a moment ago, and obviously this type of architecture with a content management system running all of these plugins, and these plugins working quite hard with user data and also managing and processing interactions such as purchases, progressing through sales funnels, progressing through email marketing funnels. The learning management system itself is quite resource hungry. All of these will require a robust hosting situation. But that's definitely possible, and even the most costly hosting situation that you could envisage for something like this would still be quite a deal less in cost than the hosting that's inherent in amongst all of these cloud services as well. Finally, the cost of entry In other words, the cost of initial setup for a system such as this is also much higher than the cost of entry for a system such as this. Overall then, I think there's a compelling argument to look at the self-hosted option for a small business or even a medium-sized business, as opposed to cloud services used in conjunction with each other. I think this is a better approach overall, particularly for a small business starting out or a small business seeking a low cost of entry, ease of management, and also resilient to things going wrong. Thanks very much for listening.